Hello everyone, today we talk about the circulation of the Justinianean legal code in early medieval Italy. So this is part of the series about medieval law concerning, in fact, largely the revival of Roman law in the High Middle Ages, chiefly from the Bolognese School, eventually spreading in all the rest of Europe, which originated from a humus of legal practice that we don't clearly know until the consolidation of the Bolognese School proper, right? At least for what concerns properly the Roman roots of the revival, better how the Corpus Juris Civilis was actually rediscovered in some way, and when and how, through which channels did this really happened. So today we will deal very briefly with the hints we have, the information we have about the circulation of the Justinian Code in Western Europe, and chiefly in Italy, where that, as you know, so the secular Byzantine presence in certain areas of the peninsula, and that therefore represents the most direct connection between the revival of Roman law and the previous imperial legislation. And with the, I think everybody knows that in this background, in which naturally we know that some parts of the code, at least, initially certain copies of the entire code for sure, but later just certain parts, obviously circulated throughout all the early medieval times in Western Europe. But fundamentally, the code in itself was unknown, right? And especially was not used, was not in force proper, as other legal systems were ruling Western Europe. And this is interesting because we will look at that when we will focus, for example, on the Longobard law in the same Italy that contemplated, just as in other places, especially in Southern Europe, the presence of Romans, right, of people that are ethnically, spotted and identifiable, and even self-identifiable in base of the juridical systems that they adopted. Right, that is, you are a Frank by the 8th century, let's say, not because you have necessarily anything to do culturally with that, but because you choose, right, or you come to enter in that system in some other way, and essentially subordinated to Frankish law. The same goes for the Longobards, the same goes for the Romans, in fact. And you know that Italy is the key land in Europe at this point, because we've made a video actually about this, talking about specifically the Frankish and the Longobard legacy in the revival of Roman law during the 11th century. We have observed how essentially the rediscovered Roman law has nothing to do with any specific need to repersonate it by itself, but simply to fill some gaps that were present in the pre-existing jurisdictions in Italy that were fundamentally the part of essentially the Longobard Code, the Frankish Code, and the feudal law, right? And plus with all the various legislations and various emperors and so on. And the interesting thing about this is that even if you look at, the late Longobard legal practice, is that you could fundamentally switch, for example, in a contract, your juridical identity. If you were a Longobard but you wanted to make a negotium, a contract in the Roman way, as long as it was consensual between the two sides, it was fine. You could do whatever you wanted. So that naturally is proof of a dynamism that has to do, in fact, with the fact that Italy is rising since the second half of the 8th century, faster, especially for what concerns, trade. Commerce in general. So all these contracts that needed a more updated, more advanced legal practice that in part the Roman code could show, right, or at least could present frames, categories that could discipline the specific legal case. And this is really the background that will be expanding mainly in other videos. Today, looking essentially at how and when the Justinian Code was read in before the proper and open revival of Roman law, right? So to give a bit of background also on how it had entered in Italy by the 6th century, because Italy, as you know, was under the first the Goths, and in part naturally the Roman law continued in there, but it was already starting to modify, and this is very important because same Romans that the Longobard law contemplates weren't disciplined actually by the Justinian law anymore. I mean, it was still a local modification fundamentally that had taken place throughout the centuries, right, in a situation in which naturally the Byzantine Empire had shrank, had heavily decentralized its political administrative structures, especially in the far west, Western Mediterranean. And therefore, there is a lot in common, actually, even between the Longobards and these Roman subjects that at a certain point even come properly under the Longobard domination. And this is the first thing we should get used to. I mean, to the fact that already by the time of the Justinianean Code, the western provinces in Europe were already something else. In many ways, there is a huge debate, naturally, regarding how this affected the legal practice. By the time of Justinian, let's say the Western Mediterranean, side of the crisis, Italy had suffered heavily from the Gothic War because essentially, the armies had gone back and forth 2-3 times during the war, had razed everything to the ground. So it was already a very different picture from what is usually attributed in terms of Romanity. Like when the Longobards came, they found the situation was already the way it was, right? They didn't even change themselves very much in that regard. It wasn't such a traumatic event. On the contrary, as a matter of fact, they gave stability to a system was compromised by actually a very heavy taxation. Italy didn't feel to be part of the empire anymore in terms of actual political interest. They didn't give a damn. These were fundamentally the Greek invaders of an empire that might have claimed to be the universal one and all, but that even with the same Roman aristocracy felt really, identically speaking, in very different ways, right? It was an enormous difference between, for example, the Italic aristocracy of before the Gothic War and the Byzantine aristocracy of Constantinople, right? They had a very different vision of the world, what Romanity was, what the true heirs, the true collectors of the Roman legacy actually were. And this is something that can be extended to other Western provinces as well. If you look at Gaul, and especially southern Gaul in a certain sense. But this is yet another topic. The point is that already by 540, Justinian had sent to Italy the texts of his compilation in order to have it published literally sub edictali programmati. Right, so in the same way, fundamentally, the other provinces, it had been issued in other provinces, and the entry into force, the official, at least entry into force of these collections, is, however, attributed to 554, when the emperor deposed formally their extension to the Italian regions, because it's essentially 1 year after the end of the Gothic War. You understand that in time of war, they could issue even his new legal system to be put in order, but with half of the peninsula still ruled by the Goths, the thing was very complicated, and that there is this tradition that fundamentally the emperor was accepting the request for such legislation to enter in force by Pope Vigilius, right? And the constitution that disposed of such extension is the famous, in fact, pragmatica sanctio pro petitione Vigili, so the pragmatic sanction because, by demand of Vigilius, of August 14th, in fact, 540. And there is this topic that has for a long time passioned the historians of law, that consists in the actual validity in Italy of the Justinian law, right? And this is what we were talking about before. the question is, if the Justinian compilation had, whether it had been capable of eliminating in the practical use the pre-existing juridical tradition that fundamentally was stuck to the Theodosian Code, that in part is in the same base actually for the Justinian Code. In many ways it's the same, but with certain modifications. It's still the Roman law in force under, in these Western provinces that were ruled by the Germanic peoples that, however, allowed, of course, the Romans to carry on with their administration, their laws, etc. And actually, Romanizing their own Germanic laws. Look at the Visigoths or the Burgundians. Like this happened partially in Italy, also under the Ostrogoths, but still, with a higher degree of Romanization for obvious reasons, because Italy being the center of Romanity in that regard, and that which had created problems at certain levels. Now, I realize we should digress on each of these topics because they are enormously important, but we have already addressed these issues in other. If you find that video on the Frankish and Longobard legacy in the revival of Roman law, you will actually understand that, right? You know what the system here was. Like there was an ethnic distinction. Like the Germans had their own law, the Romans had their own law, but on the long run, these things were blending. We will have, in fact, to make a video for each one of the Goths, the Burgundians, and so on. But for this reason, you understand that every country, every chunk of this Romano-Germanic kingdoms had developed fundamentally its own laws in many ways. Like the Ostrogoths hadn't been there forever. Like they had been there from essentially 60 years by this point, and still that's enough. But especially the destruction of the peninsula during the Gothic War was the major problem. Like was a single most devastating factor that put in crisis the same base of the late antique system that the Justinian Code was disciplining, right? That's also why the Longobards had a terrific success with their own legislation, because the Romano-Italic populations, were way better off with the Germanic model was presented by the Longobards in terms of politics, institutions, administration, that the Byzantine one, that's so Italy now just essentially as a decentralized province of the empire, right? And they didn't give much damn, aside from the fact that Rome had its own importance, that southern Italy especially had this major cities, even central Italy for that matter, but still there was naturally a much greater continuity with Byzantine presence in southern Italy than in the rest of the peninsula, especially on the coasts. But this was essentially another land, right, compared to what Constantinople had gone in its own way from the other side. So this is the main problem that we have, even to understand what the hell did happen here, right? And consider also that there are essentially 30 years for this, for the Corpus Juris Civilis to have kicked in the administrative practice, because the majority of the central and northern Italian regions were taken over by the Longobards. So the Byzantine government fundamentally disappeared in most of those areas by 568, 569, whatever you want to place the Longobard invasion, and therefore there were a few lustra after the Pragmatica Sanctio had entered in force. And there is no general consensus about what the reality was, because some scholars have stressed the fact that the brevity of the Byzantine dominion in Italy, the Justinian reconquest, hadn't allowed to surpass the resistance of the Western juridical tradition, right? That was not very open to accept the Justinian novelties, and also the more accentuated abstraction of the Byzantine juridical culture, right? As we were saying before, these were very different political and social systems. So few-time cultural barrier. Other scholars has instead, on the contrary, believed that the introduction of the Justinian texts had triggered, a safe elimination of the previous sources, and that the Byzantine domination that went on, after all, in some areas of the peninsula after the Longobard invasion had, in many ways, all the time to take care of the effective reception of the new law, of the new legislation. And as you understand, I think we never made a comprehensive video about the properly, like, the how it, and I was asked by the way to make a video about what was actually the Longobard Byzantine frontier in Italy about. We will have to make a massive video about that, and we have actually pretty detailed and accurate knowledge, after all, for the times and spaces of how the thing went on. And these interpretations obviously are more or less correct, simply depending on when and where this should have happened. But in a broader sense, right, as we will see now, there's the general understanding that, after all, whatever happened, whatever this norm, the whole legislation was introduced in Italy, the results were poor. Like, these regions, even if under Byzantine control, soon increased kind of their own autonomy. They weren't so receptive and so interested, aside from trade and other kind of strictly economical interests, to be directly under a firm rule, or there wasn't even actually a very solid control of the social realities. For example, aside from the fact lots of Byzantine subjects that, because of Byzantine taxations, actually fled from the Byzantine held controlled territories to the Longobard ones, by the way, because they had much easier in there. The general picture is that the same late antiquity there was about to crumble from in a few generations. Think about the Islamic invasions in the east. Think the contraction of Constantinople under these other peoples, of the steppes, of the even of the same previously to the Islamic invasion to the Persian frontier. I mean, how much trouble, and we made a lot of videos about the crisis of the Byzantine state, of Roman state, by essentially the 7th century. So whichever things went by the 6th, and whichever the success of the new legislation had been in the West, of course, this thing diluted itself in the local customs and practice much more than we think. But still, it makes a difference to assess, after all, what happened at the very beginning. Because if by the time that the Byzantines had a somewhat firm control the first decades on the Italian peninsula, it made an important difference if the juridical practice had been completely reshaped, right, or the process had much kicked in, right? And unfortunately, we do not know. And the thesis of the immediacy, of the enforcement in Italy of the Justinian legislation is enriched also by the idea, at least the theory, of an alleged school of law that would have been active in Rome during the 6th century, and in which the institutiones of the Corpus Juris Civilis would have provided actually the foundation of the teaching, right? And this idea was formulated a lot of time ago, and imagining that the Roman school as having disappeared only in the 11th century, where these were older historiographies that reason as if that there hadn't been much of a change after all during the early medieval times, from the late antique ones. This is actually really not proven at all, right? The matter, of course, is today, historiographically speaking, put in very different ways, but just specifically for the Roman school, this would have had allegedly important masters, such as, according to this theory, to certain Geminianos, that would have been master of Irnerius, that from Bologna, that we know as the founder of the Bolognese studies in the 11th century. But the idea of a school of law active in Rome in the 6th century, that's been contested and, in fact, generally refuted. Right, some scholar has resumed it, but without actually indicating any safe proof, especially of contemporary sources. Right, and therefore the majority of historiography today believes that this school actually never existed. This is not to say that, of course, in Rome there wasn't any legal teaching in this regard. Rome remained basically the single most important Western city up to, in fact, very late in time, easily by the 11th century, especially as a cultural center, and we know of a strong continuity of the Roman contacts with Constantinople, in spite of the evaporation, we could say, of the actual Byzantine government in the city after some century. Rome was fundamentally under the papacy, and grew at least to control the local Roman families that were all one bit with the new, the episcopal power of the city. And we know there was Rome was a multilingual city, right? The presence of Greek was quite important. We know it from early medieval epigraphy. We know it from many aspects, and we know, of course, now up to the beginning of the 7th century, the Corpus Juris Civilis was there, as we'll see now. But we don't have evidence of a major school of law that would have re-triggered eventually the rise of Roman law by the 11th century. And finding this connection, there is actually no proof of sort by this in this sense. Also, for what concerns the spread of the Justinianean collections in Italy during the early Middle Ages, a long-lasting thesis stated that the institutiones had been largely and integrally actually known and used in the schools of liberal arts and also in the practice. That the Codex was preserved, but in its kind of summarized form of the Epitome Codices, concerning only the first 9 books of the originary work, these were part of the broader code, and they had gone lost in part, specifically the last 3 books that dedicated to the administrative and financial system of the Roman Empire weren't seen of much use by the jurists of Longobard and Frankish Italy. That the novelle were known in the reduced form of the Epitome Juliani, and that the digestum, given the complexity of the text, had been abandoned by the jurists, the culture of whom was inadequate to understand the refinement of the work after that the years of the pontificate of Gregory the Great, 590-604. In fact, as we were saying before, the Pope to whom is attributed the last quote from the last mention of the work in a letter of 603. And the knowledge of the institutiones would have been witnessed in particular by some works that contained the text together to a gloss apparatus, and this work would have been known as the Tournai's gloss, right? That is preserved at the National Library of Turin in a manuscript that was dated to the 9th century, that would have essentially contained the glosses of a previous age, some of which, according to some scholars, datable to the same Justinianean age, right? And also of the 10th century manuscript preserved at the State Library of Bamberg, with the glosses that, instead of being dated at least in part to the 6th century. So the knowledge of the Codex from his own way would have been witnessed instead by the so-called Summa Perusina that was essentially a collection of summaries of some constitutions, was attributed to the 10th century, and also the Pistoiese gloss. That's a work contained in a manuscript of the code that has been epitomated and enriched by explicative glosses of single terms, and that is dated to the 10th century. So the topic of the presence of Justinianean texts in early medieval Italy has known in the last generations, an important contribution from the side of juridical paleography, that is specializing, in fact, in this legal direction, and that actually has corrected a lot of the traditional dating of the manuscripts that we have just mentioned, and that had fundamentally consolidated the previous historiographical interpretations. And according to certain studies, for the period that spans between essentially late 6th and the late 8th centuries, there is actually no evidence of manuscripts of the Justinianean texts. Like the only exceptions would have been constituted by the aforementioned Summa Perusina, that has been dated to the end of the 6th and beginning of the 7th century, or maximum at 50 years later, and some summary chapters of the novella were also considered to have been roughly of the same period. So here we are in Longobard, Italy. So when the Edictum Rotari was in force. For what concerns instead the Carolingian era, right? There is an increase of manuscripts of the Epitome Iuliani, right? While there is a scarcity of the codes of the Institutiones before at least the beginning of the 11th century. So much later, and there is also no evidence of the Codex before the half of the same century. Right, this is particularly important. So the Epitome Iuliani, as a consequence, it results to be the most spread Justinian text in use in the early Middle Ages in Western Europe, and specifically in Italy. And this is confirmed also by certain works that can't be dated to the 9th and 10th century that actually contain some passages drawn from the Institutiones and from the Codex, but they are, preponderantly referred to the Epitome Iuliani still, right? And these works are essentially the Lex Romana Canonice Compta, that is dated to the essentially late 9th, 10th century fundamentally, and the Collectio Anselmo Dedicata, which is a work that in all likelihood was drawn from, derived from a previous work, and also from the Excerpta Bobiensia. And this you understand, these are coming from actually northern Italy. So we are in a context that has nothing to do with the Byzantine presence anymore. And some quote comes from the Institutiones and the Codex, also together with the much more numerous, alongside with much more numerous ones of the Epitome Iuliani, in letters that come from popes properly. Nicholas I, 858-867, John VIII, 872-882, right? And this is very interesting because this naturally proves that the same popes had an idea of the reminiscence of these laws, but also do not really show actually a deep juridical preparation, but rather of an ideological program for which the papacy was now using these texts of the Roman law as a symbol of the Roman past, of which the papacy and the church in general were claiming now the legacy of, right? This is particularly important because these are the same centuries in which the church is building together also with the the Western Empire at this point, the idea of essentially of the Roman the imperial Roman legacy in the West. The Church naturally was claiming for itself, at least in authoritative matters, over the emperors. But think about the Donatio Constantini and all these other works that were specifically designed to claim quite clearly now that the Roman Church was assuming a power of imperial scale, right, or at least of Roman authority dated back to the same Roman imperial law in this sense. And for what concerns instead the digestum, right, that will become, as we have seen in the videos on the Bolognese School, actually the single most important part of the Corpus Juris Civilis in low medieval Europe. In these centuries, in early medieval Italy, it's being believed that the text of the work had to be transcribed in Constantinople in multiple copies, some of which were sent to Italy, and according to the story, let's say, left by the glossarist Odofred, that we have encountered him in the other videos about medieval law. It was a jurist of the 13th century. One of these copies would have arrived in Pisa, right? And this would have remained. In fact, we made a video about this, about the Littera Pisana, in fact, that in fact was found in the 15th century by the Florentine humanists after they conquered Pisa in 1406. I mean, not the humanists, but Florence. Well, the humanists eventually sacked the libraries that were so avid of, and finding this and transferring it to their own commune and starting. We have seen it, starting this other humanistic tradition. The video I made, in fact, was on juridical humanism proper, and that was this discipline. It eventually had spread from Florence to other countries in Europe, notably France, to starting almost their own kind of doctrine that was conflictual with the one of the Bolognese School. Was starting from simply other ideological differences, and some scholars have judged Odofred's statement truthful, right? Simply for the fact that he was talking about it one century before it was eventually found in the same Pisa, right? By other, and that actually he stated had served for the same Bolognese School that was aware of it to go there and check it, and the whole deal of the school was to reconstruct the Roman law and the digestum especially. So there is actually it's likely to be true, but other scholars, including Kantorovicz, for example, gave to the Pisant Florentine manuscript another origin, right? And specifically Kantorovicz has believed it to be written in an eastern province of the empire, so somewhere in probably, I don't know specifically, but possibly even in Asia, right? Considered that the main juridical school of the empire in Justinian times was in Beirut, right, in Lebanon. So that is a possibility. While others have believed it to be a work composed in Ravenna, so the capital of the Byzantine Exarchate of Italy, that controlled basically almost all the whole peninsular domains of Constantinople. But not for teaching, right, at a local, to local jurists, but for the high functionaries of the empire, right, of Ravenna, that would have been just representative of imperial majesty, right? There is this whole thing in codicology and paleography that we have assessed quite clearly, that basically by the time of late antiquity, the books, the codes, and specifically the Perpetua Sanctio that the Corpus Juris Civilis and the Theodosian Code before even had embodied, were not much, codes to be read, but codes to be kept closed, like just in the iconography, right? You see that in previous centuries the books are open, afterwards they are closed, and they're encrusted with gold, gems, and all this stuff to just show the imperial majesty and the secrecy and the impenetrability of the mystery of the law in that case, that had to reflect the same divine perfection. So it couldn't be fully reached, but theoretically just the emperor could. And there's all this mysticism that was very autocratic naturally, and in a way that you understand why the cultural barrier, because the rest of the western provinces were very different. They hadn't developed at all into an autocratic system like in the East, like in Constantinople. This thing was becoming something very different. So, in practice, according to this last, hypothesis, this thing would have not even actually circulated as such. But recently has been proposed also yet another origin of the Pisan manuscript, and it would have been connected basically to the numerous copies of the Digestum that had to be composed in Italy during the Byzantine domination, copies that with the passing of time ended up to actually diverge from the original text. That's the transformation we were talking about before at the beginning. Even the local customs are the same Romans, right? Because simply of and banally of the frequent mistakes of transcriptions committed by the scribes, right? And don't think it was something strange, not even in Byzantine Italy. It was one of the most literate areas in Europe at that time. Think with the Bible, the same happened, I don't know, look at Bavarian Bibles at the time of Charlemagne. I mean, that was not the Bible, that was plain gibberish. They completely invented the words because they didn't even know what Latin was, right? And they simply, and this is something that went on up to major reforms, right? So with a fundamentally ever more decentralized and weaker Byzantine government until some waves of reconquest later on, where even the code at that point was different because it changed also in the Eastern Roman Empire. So all that late antique legacy had gone lost in many ways, or at least in its original system. The text the original text had stopped circulating as such, and this is more likely to have happened not in Ravenna, but in southern Italy. That was the least exposed to the looming threats of the Longobards, right? And in particular, according to some, and more in particular in one of the most famous writing centers of those regions, that is Vivarium, right? That had been created in Calabria and Squillace by none less than Cassiodorus, that, as you know, was one of the single most important cultural figures of late antiquity, and one of the true last of the in the sense of a legacy that was going to be lost. Like Cassiodorus himself had lived his last period of life in this retirement that was fed by with great cultural activity that included also the preservation of late antique culture, but still in a context that didn't give much further possibility for this legacy to be fully maintained in the practice. And from here, the manuscript would have been transported to Pisa in a year that we have no idea of. But these are just hypotheses, however. For what concerns eventually the role of the Pisan, Florentine, whatever you want to call it, manuscript in the reconstruction of the Justinianean work, well, we have talked about it in the video on juridical humanism, and we will also see it a bit better in the for what concerns the work of Ignatius of Bologna and of his scholars, right? And there is all a broader net of manuscripts from which the various ones would have been derived, but anyhow, this is secondary. But this is just for pointing out what seems to be the most, likely scenario that we. I think I even once at university I met a professor that taught us this one lesson about specifically this topic. I don't remember much of it because he was a guest. He went there by chance. But I remember, clearly this fact that, of course, we know that the Justinian Code circulated, right? This is something that, generally speaking, we can be sure of. It's properly that this text was not systematically employed for studying it, for teaching it, because the juridical practice was completely different, right? It could naturally be of interest and of use, and we know there was a continuity of some sort, right? The various texts of the ancient past were known, were preserved, were treasured in many ways, but the development of this into a juridical practice is a wholly different matter that we will be analyzing. But it's still important that this connection remained fundamentally closer in time and space than it seems, right? The fact that for this very reason we don't have to think at the loss of Roman law as a dramatic thing, but simply as a natural adaptation to the uses, the circumstances. We'll see it very much better in the videos we will make on the Romano-Germanic juridical systems, because those were the ones that de facto substituted, if not the Justinian law, but at least the Theodosian one. And we will understand actually how important these Romano-Germanic developments were for not merely a passive revival, reacquisition of Roman law, but actually with its very flexible, vivacious, intelligent reacquisition for the sake of this, juridical systems that had evolved and developed in the meanwhile, and that would have, been the same cause of the revival, the Roman law, after all. So we have spent other words for this in other videos, but in any case, we will observe it in again. Now, I don't want to sound mysterious if you have that, if you maybe have never heard these topics, or if you've never listened to one of my videos, for example, may sound mysterious a bit, but as I was saying, there is the medieval law playlist, and we will make other videos on this topic. This one is to be just very simply about what, in fact, we have explained, but also in the broader perspective of the problem of the fact that still this times and spaces are not random, right? Now there is probably a centrality that the Italian peninsula had in fact in making emerge once again this juridical tradition, which is not has nothing teleological about it, right? That there are specific events that triggered it, and that are not simply only because, I don't know, Italy was better connected to the Eastern Mediterranean, or because it was the birthplace of the Romanity, of the Roman law, etc. There is much more to it that we'll have to see, which is for the sake especially of medieval history way more, and its consequences, way more important than these factors specifically. But for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.